My aunt ruined my wedding to protect a family secret, and now she's begging for my forgiveness. But I acted decisively even then. My wedding day was supposed to be perfect, the culmination of a beautiful love story between me and Ethan. I'm 27, and he's 29. And we've been together for 4 years before we decided to make it official. I'm not exaggerating when I say that it felt like something straight out of a romance movie. We met by accident at a concert, started talking, and then kept finding excuses to see each other until we both admitted we were falling hard. Ethan's always been the calm to my storm, the person who pulls me back down to earth when I get a bit too wrapped up in my head. And if that wasn't enough, he's been incredibly close to my family, especially my mom, Charlotte, who's 54, and my aunt, Vivian, who's 57. Charlotte and Vivian are sisters, but they've always had a relationship that was more complicated than I could fully understand. They'd bickered occasionally, but always kept things polite and supportive on the surface. That day, I was too wrapped up in the magic of the moment to see the brewing tension. I remember standing in the bridal suite with my mom fussing over my veil, her eyes tearing up as she admired the dress she and I had chosen together months ago. I'd seen her emotional before, but there was something different about her energy that day. Nervous, maybe? Looking back, there was probably more beneath the surface, but I was too distracted to notice. The ceremony itself was set in a small garden, filled with friends and family, rows of seats lined with flowers, soft music playing in the background. The aisle was all a blur, and my heart hammered in my chest when I caught sight of Ethan waiting for me, that warm, reassuring smile I knew so well lighting up his face. But just as the officiant began to lead us into the vows, a figure abruptly rose from the crowd, and the whole scene shifted into something almost surreal. A hymn, a loud voice cut through the air, jolting everyone out of the moment. I looked over, and to my horror, it was Aunt Vivian, standing up in her bright green dress, looking furious and determined. Vivian had always been a little dramatic, the kind of person who loved being the center of attention, but this was something entirely different. "Madison, there's something you need to know before you say I do," she declared, her voice ringing out like a gavel. My heart sank. I could feel everyone staring at her, at me, and then back at her. My mom was frozen, her eyes widening with a look I hadn't seen before. It was fear, I think now. She started to rise but stopped, maybe knowing this was out of her control. "Aunt Vivian," I said, desperately trying to keep my voice steady, "this isn't the time." "Oh, but it is the time," she insisted, glancing around as if daring anyone to try to stop her. "I can't sit by and watch this happen. Madison, I love you like my own, but you need to know the truth about your family before you make this decision." The officiant looked completely bewildered. I could see Ethan glancing at me, his face a mix of confusion and sympathy, but he didn't try to interfere. I think he knew this was something bigger than him, something that had nothing to do with us as a couple, but rather, something buried deep in my family's past. "Aunt Vivian, if this is some joke or attempt to stir up drama," I began, though a lump was forming in my throat. There was something in her eyes that told me this wasn't a prank. It was real, and it was about to change everything. Vivian took a deep breath, her face twisting as though she was battling against herself to get the words out. "I'm sorry, Maddie, but I can't let you go through with this until you know that, well, Ethan may not be who you think he is. There are things your mother and I have hidden from you, things that affect this marriage." There it was. The wedding was officially unraveling, and I could feel the ground slip away under me. People in the audience were murmuring, casting worried glances, and my mom was practically white as a sheet, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something but couldn't bring herself to. "What do you mean?" I demanded, my voice rising in pitch as my mind scrambled to comprehend what was happening. "Aunt Vivian, please just say whatever you need to say or sit back down." But she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. "Your mother has kept secrets from you, secrets about the family. And one of those secrets, it concerns Ethan and his connection to us." At this, Ethan looked as stunned as I felt. I reached out and held his hand tightly, needing his support to keep myself together. "Vivian, stop it now." My mom finally broke in, standing up, her voice quivering. "This is enough. This isn't your place to say anything. Maybe it should have been, Vivian shot back bitterly. You always wanted to protect her from the truth, and now look at where that's gotten us. The guests were looking between us like they were watching a soap opera live. My hands felt cold, my pulse pounding as I begged for someone, anyone, to make sense of this. Mom, I pleaded, feeling like a child again. Please, what is she talking about? What truth? For a long, painful moment, my mother just looked at me, her expression a mix of regret and sorrow. She opened her mouth, then closed it, clearly fighting to find the words. I didn't want you to find out like this, she whispered, glancing over at Vivian with a hard look that could have burned a hole through steel. This is not how this should have come out. So you did keep something from me? I asked, feeling like my heart might shatter then and there. She hesitated, but Vivian jumped in. Charlotte, you have to tell her, or I will. She deserves to know before she marries him. The finality in her voice left no room for argument. My mom drew in a breath, her shoulders slumping as though she were finally surrendering to something she'd fought to keep hidden for years. Yes, Madison, there's something you should know about Ethan's family, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wouldn't meet my gaze, but I knew in that moment that my aunt wasn't lying, that something incredibly dark and twisted lay buried in our family's history. And then, she said it. There was an affair. A long time ago, before you were born, she admitted, her voice shaking. Your father had, well, he had a relationship with someone outside the family. What does that have to do with Ethan? I demanded, feeling my body tremble. My mom looked away, and Vivian answered, that affair. It resulted in a child. And that child is somehow connected to Ethan. My stomach twisted as the words sank in. A sense of dread filled me as I looked over at Ethan, who appeared as lost as I was, and then at the faces of my family. I felt like I was living in someone else's nightmare. In the silence that followed, I barely heard the gasps and murmurs of the guests. The wedding I had envisioned, the perfect union of love and joy, was now in shambles, left in ruins by a family secret that had been buried too long. And as I stood there, staring at my mother and aunt, I realized that everything I'd known about my family, about my very existence, had just shifted in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. The reception had turned into a chaotic mess. After Aunt Vivian's outburst, the guests either left in hurried embarrassment or stayed, shamelessly whispering in small circles, their eyes darting between me, my mother, and Vivian. I was numb, my heart bruised and battered, the image of my perfect wedding now shattered. Ethan, who was as blindsided as I was, had his own questions, but we agreed he'd give me space to confront my family alone. He left with a kiss on my forehead, his warm touch a reminder that we'd get through this together. But right then, I needed answers. Once the guests had cleared out and it was just the family, I found my mom sitting alone in the bridal suite, her shoulders slumped as though carrying the weight of the world. The contrast was striking. Earlier, she'd been beaming with pride, but now she looked like a woman torn apart by regrets and secrets. Mom, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. No more dancing around this. I need to know what Aunt Vivian was talking about. Now. She looked up, her face pale and drawn. Madison, honey, I wanted to protect you from all of this. I never wanted it to come out like this, especially not on your wedding day, but it did, Mom. And Aunt Vivian said you've kept secrets from me my whole life. Do you have any idea how that feels? I felt the tears well up, but I held them back, determined not to show how much this was breaking me. She sighed, looking down at her hands. It's a complicated story, and it goes back decades. Things were different then, Maddie. And your father and I, well, we weren't perfect. She glanced away, as if the memory of him hurt. Your father made mistakes, mistakes that I thought were long buried. But your Aunt Vivian, she always held on to it. Mom, stop with the vague explanations and tell me what happened, I pressed. What does this have to do with Ethan? Is he my brother? I could hardly get the words out, my voice breaking. Her eyes widened, and she shook her head vigorously. No, he's not your brother, Madison. But there is a connection. Your father had an affair years ago, before you were born. And it was with a woman who had ties to Vivian. Ties to Vivian? I repeated, my mind racing, trying to understand. Yes, she said slowly. The woman he was involved with was Vivian's best friend. Her name was Lydia. They were close, practically inseparable since high school. Vivian introduced Lydia to your father during a summer cookout, and things spiraled from there. I blinked, feeling the pieces start to click together. So, you're saying my dad had an affair with Aunt Vivian's best friend? And they had a child? My mom nodded, looking away. Yes, Lydia got pregnant, but she never told your father. She didn't want to ruin his life with me, or so she said. She was young, scared. She raised the baby on her own with Vivian's support. Vivian felt betrayed, but she couldn't abandon her best friend, even if she was furious at your father. My mind was spinning, fragments of childhood memories flickering to the surface. There were moments when Aunt Vivian would be cold or distant, and times when I'd caught her whispering with my mom in hushed tones. I'd always dismissed it as typical family drama, but now I realized those whispers were about me, about a lie I'd been unknowingly living. Does Ethan know any of this? I asked, terrified of what that answer might be. No, he doesn't, my mom replied. As far as he's concerned, he's just Lydia's son. He never met his father, never knew the full story of why Lydia had raised him alone. And since you and Ethan met years later, there was no reason for him to question anything. But Aunt Vivian couldn't let it go, I whispered, feeling my anger boil. She knew about Ethan's connection and decided to wait until the worst possible moment to tell me. My mom looked away, clearly pained. Vivian never forgave your father for what he did. I think it broke something in her, Madison. She felt he betrayed her, too, in a way, by hurting the two people she cared about most, me and Lydia. 100 thoughts tumbled through my mind, each one uglier than the last. So Aunt Vivian thought she was, what, protecting me? By ruining my wedding? Mom hesitated. I think, in her mind, she believed she was saving you from repeating history. Maybe she thought that by revealing the truth, she could stop you from making a mistake. But it wasn't her place, and it certainly wasn't her choice. Suddenly, memories I'd long forgotten surfaced with sharp clarity, things I'd brushed off at the time, but now seemed significant. Like the odd times Aunt Vivian would show up at our house and pull my mom into another room to talk urgently, or the way she'd sometimes look at my dad with a guarded disdain. And, I realized, all the strange comments she'd made over the years about love and betrayal. She'd never outright told me anything, but she dropped hints, hoping I'd piece it together. Feeling sick, I asked, did you and Dad try to keep Vivian out after the affair? Is that why she's always had this bitterness toward us? My mother nodded, her expression sad. We thought it would be easier to move on if we distanced ourselves. Your father apologized, of course, and he was heartbroken over what he'd done. But Vivian never truly let it go. For years, she supported Lydia, helped raise Ethan, and kept the secret. But the resentment grew. I felt something harden in my chest. So, Aunt Vivian took it upon herself to make sure I'd suffer, too. She decided to punish me because she couldn't punish Dad anymore. I'm sorry, Madison, my mom said softly, reaching for my hand. But I pulled away, too hurt to accept her comfort. I never wanted this for you. I tried to keep everything buried, for your sake. But secrets like these, they don't stay buried forever. What do I do now, Mom? I asked, feeling as though the life I'd known was slipping through my fingers. How do I even look at Ethan after this? How do I marry him? Knowing what? She asked gently. That his mother was betrayed? That your father made a terrible mistake? None of that changes who Ethan is, or the love you two have. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the image of Aunt Vivian standing up in the middle of my wedding, looking me dead in the eyes and declaring that she was saving me, felt too raw, too ugly to ignore. She'd known exactly what she was doing, and it had left a scar on my heart that wouldn't fade easily. I think I need to talk to Aunt Vivian, I said finally, my voice trembling. I need to hear it from her. All of it. If she has so much to say about my life, then she can say it to my face. My mom's face tightened with worry. Just be careful, Madison. Vivian's always believed her version of events, and she's convinced herself she's right. But remember, you have the power to make your own decisions. Don't let her manipulate you. I nodded, feeling a surge of determination rise within me. I had grown up with love, trust, and a sense of stability, all of which had been ripped apart in a matter of minutes. Now, I needed to confront the person who had been pulling the strings, the woman who had cast herself as my protector but had only succeeded in destroying what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I realized I wasn't just leaving her behind. I was leaving behind the illusion of who I'd thought she was, and maybe even a part of myself that had once believed family could never truly betray you. I knew now that sometimes, the ones who claim to love you the most can hurt you in ways you never saw coming. Leaving Vivian's house, I felt a simmering anger that had morphed into something productive, something determined. I wanted my life back, the one she had stolen the moment she decided to stage her dramatic reveal in the middle of my wedding. I needed to uncover the depths of her manipulation, not just to confront her, but to make sure she'd never pull anything like this again. If there was any justice, she would be exposed to the family she had tried so hard to control. Back home, I began by reaching out to my mom. She'd already told me most of the story, but I had a feeling there were still pieces I didn't know. When I sat her down and explained what I'd learned from Vivian, my mom looked relieved. I think she was finally ready to unburden herself. "Madison," she said softly, "Vivian has always had a way of twisting things to make herself look like the victim. She's a master at planting seeds of doubt and resentment. For years, she's tried to turn members of our family against each other, always coming out looking like the one trying to hold everything together." My mom went on to tell me how, after the affair, Vivian had isolated Lydia from others in the family, often feeding her negative ideas about my dad and even my mom. Though Lydia had been her best friend, Vivian would subtly convince her that she was better off keeping her distance, supposedly to protect Lydia from further hurt. And, to my horror, Mom revealed that Vivian had occasionally interfered in my life growing up, too. "You remember how, when you were younger, she'd invite you over for weekends?" my mom asked, hesitating. I nodded. I'd always thought Vivian had just wanted to be the fun aunt who could spoil me with junk food and take me on outings. But there was something haunted in my mom's expression that made me realize those weekends had been more strategic than I'd known. "She told you things, didn't she? About loyalty, about never letting people get away with lies," my mom said. "It was all so insidious. She was subtly shaping your ideas about family." I felt a chill run down my spine as I remembered Vivian's life lessons. I had thought they were eccentric advice, nothing serious, but now I understood that she'd been laying the groundwork for a future confrontation, planting in me a doubt about honesty and loyalty that might one day turn me against my mom. Fueled by this revelation, I knew I had to find out more. I decided to meet with my Uncle David, my mom and Vivian's older brother. He was someone who'd always been on the periphery of family events, a quiet man who stayed out of drama. If anyone knew more about Vivian's schemes, it was him. When I called, David was reluctant at first. But when I mentioned what had happened at my wedding, his voice softened, and he agreed to meet me for coffee. Sitting across from him in the cafe, I noticed he seemed nervous, as if unsure how much he should share. After some gentle prodding, he began to open up. "Madison," he started, "Vivian's had a way of controlling people, in subtle ways, for as long as I can remember. She thrives on drama, even if she pretends to hate it. After your dad's affair, she twisted it to make herself look like the hero who had to protect Lydia and you and everyone else. And the worst part is, she convinced herself she was doing the right thing." I asked him if there were specific things she'd done to drive wedges in the family. He nodded, sighing heavily. "She's always been good at turning people against each other. After the affair, she told Lydia that your mother was complicit, that Charlotte didn't care enough to stop it. She did it slowly, of course, over years, letting her resentment drip into every conversation until Lydia barely spoke to Charlotte. And then, she tried it with you, too, didn't she?" I explained the life lessons and the way Vivian had tried to shape my view of loyalty and truth. David shook his head, disappointment etched across his face. "She's clever," he admitted, "but she's also deeply insecure. When things don't go her way, She starts working in the shadows, trying to control situations from behind the scenes. With each piece of information David shared, a picture of Vivian as a master manipulator came into focus. Her schemes weren't just about me and my mom. They stretched back years, targeting people she saw as competition or threats, all under the guise of family protection. My wedding had simply been her latest attempt to play the role of martyr and self-appointed protector. Armed with this information, I went on a mission to talk to other family members. The story was the same from everyone. Vivian had sown seeds of discord in nearly every relationship she could touch. Cousins, aunts, even in-laws had felt her meddling. People had suspected but never confronted her, brushing off her actions as harmless eccentricity. But now, seeing how her schemes had exploded at my wedding, they started to recognize just how calculated she had been. Slowly, I managed to gather family support. I shared the truth of what happened with each person I spoke to, emphasizing how Vivian had used her concern to manipulate everyone around her. One by one, I convinced them that her actions had crossed a line, that her manipulations had fractured our family instead of protecting it. A few days later, my mom organized a family meeting to bring everything into the open. The air was thick with tension as everyone gathered, each of them well aware of the purpose of this meeting. Vivian arrived last, clearly aware she was about to be confronted. Her face was hard, defiant, but I could see the hint of fear in her eyes. I took a deep breath and began, recounting everything I discovered about her years of meddling and manipulation. I looked around at the faces of my family members, each one nodding in agreement, affirming the stories I shared. My words grew more confident as I explained how Vivian had made herself indispensable to Lydia, isolating her from others, and how she tried to do the same with me, using loyalty as a weapon. Sitting in the silence of his house, I thought of the summers I'd spent here, of the stories Grandpa had shared, and of the secrets he'd kept locked away. The power he'd given me felt heavy, like a weight pressing on my chest, but I knew I had to make a choice. As I left the study, the letter still clutched in my hand. I knew one thing for sure. Whatever decision I made, it would change my family forever. I spent days wrestling with what to do. Grandpa's final confession weighed heavily on me, making sleep elusive and filling my mind with endless questions. My cousins, Aiden, Lily, and Grace, were blissfully unaware of everything, going on with their lives as if Grandpa's passing hadn't left any lingering mysteries. Part of me envied them for that, for not having to grapple with secrets, debts, or family betrayals. But their indifference also made me feel alone, like I was the only one who truly cared about what Grandpa had tried to fix, even if he hadn't done it perfectly. It wasn't long before a family gathering forced us all to be in the same room again. It was a casual brunch, something Aunt Debbie had put together in Grandpa's memory. As I arrived, I noticed Aiden and Lily laughing about something, looking carefree. Grace was with her fiancé, talking excitedly about their upcoming wedding. I felt out of place, burdened with knowledge they didn't have, knowledge that would alter everything if I let it. At one point, as we were all gathered around, someone brought up Grandpa's inheritance. Lily rolled her eyes, saying, it was nice of Grandpa, but let's be honest. It wasn't exactly a life-changing amount. Aiden chuckled, nodding. Yeah, I blew through it on my loans. But hey, free money's free money, right? I couldn't hold back anymore. The dismissive tone, the way they treated Grandpa's gift as some casual handout, made my blood boil. Do you all realize what that small token actually meant? I blurted, feeling my heartbeat hammering in my chest. They looked at me, surprised. Grace's eyes widened slightly, but Aiden just smirked. Yeah, it meant he liked us enough to give us something, he said, as if he were stating the obvious. No, I said, shaking my head, feeling the weight of Grandpa's secrets pressing down. It wasn't a gift, not in the way you think. It was repayment. Grandpa felt he owed it to you, to make up for something that happened a long time ago. They stared at me, confusion flickering across their faces. Lily crossed her arms. What are you talking about, Taylor? Repayment for what? I took a deep breath, feeling the enormity of what I was about to say. Grandpa was carrying a burden he'd hidden from everyone. Our family went through a huge betrayal decades ago. His siblings, They swindled him out of family assets, and in his own way, Grandpa tried to even the score by keeping some of the funds for himself. When he gave you all that money, it wasn't some random act of generosity. It was his way of repaying a debt he believed he owed. For a moment, they were all silent. The room felt tense, the air thick with disbelief. Aiden was the first to break the silence, his voice laced with irritation. "So, you're saying Grandpa was some kind of thief? That doesn't sound like him at all." "It wasn't theft," I argued, trying to explain what Grandpa had told me. "It was complicated. He felt betrayed by his siblings and took what he thought was rightfully his, but he regretted it. And he spent his entire life trying to make amends." Grace's face had gone pale, her hand covering her mouth. "Oh my God, I had no idea. He never said a word about any of this." "Well, of course he didn't," Aiden scoffed, his tone skeptical. "Why would he keep it quiet all these years just to have it come out now? Are you sure you're not just, I don't know, misinterpreting things?" "I'm not misinterpreting anything," I snapped, feeling defensive. "He left me with a letter. It explained everything, why he did what he did, and why he gave you the inheritance. He wanted to make things right, even if it wasn't a perfect solution." Lily shook her head, her eyes flashing with anger. "So you knew all this, and you decided to just tell us now? When he's not even here to defend himself?" Her words stung, but I held my ground. "I thought you had the right to know the truth. Don't you get it? This wasn't just some random act of generosity. Grandpa was trying to fix something that had haunted him for decades." "Haunted?" Aiden echoed, laughing bitterly. "So, what? You're saying he gave us tainted money?" I felt myself growing frustrated, hurt that they didn't seem to grasp the depth of what Grandpa had done. He did what he thought was best. He was carrying all this guilt alone, and this was his way of making things right. You weren't just gifted that money. You were being repaid for a debt none of you even knew existed. Grace's eyes were teary, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't understand. Why didn't he just tell us himself?" "Because he was ashamed," I replied softly. "He didn't want you to see him as someone who had made mistakes. He wanted to make things right quietly, to protect our family's reputation." Aiden shook his head, still unconvinced. "And what about you, Taylor? Why did he tell you? Why did he leave you everything else?" "I don't know," I admitted, feeling the weight of their gazes on me. Maybe he trusted me to handle it, or maybe he thought I'd understand. But he left me with this choice, and I'm telling you because I thought you deserved to know." Lily stood up, crossing her arms tightly. "So, what now? Are you expecting us to feel grateful? Guilty? I don't know what you want from us, Taylor." "I'm not asking for anything," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I just wanted you to know the truth. What you do with it is up to you." Aiden looked at me with a cold expression. "So, you're saying Grandpa left you in charge of everything else? All his things, the house, whatever money's left. You're the keeper of his legacy now? Is that it?" I could hear the bitterness in his voice, and it hurt. "I didn't ask for this, Aiden. I didn't want to be the one carrying all of this. But Grandpa trusted me, and I'm trying to honor that." Grace looked at me, her expression a mix of confusion and sadness. "This changes everything. All these years, we thought we knew him." There was silence, a thick tension settling over us. Each of my cousins seemed lost in their own thoughts, processing the revelation in different ways. Aiden looked resentful, like he'd been cheated out of some idealized image of Grandpa. Lily was angry, her arms crossed defensively. And Grace, for once, was quiet, lost in her own thoughts. Finally, Lily broke the silence. "So, what are you going to do, Taylor? Are you going to keep everything, or are you planning to share this big, burdened legacy of his?" Her words stung, but I could see the pain behind her anger. "I haven't decided yet," I admitted. "But whatever I choose, it won't change what Grandpa did, or what he tried to make up for. That's his legacy, whether we like it or not." Vivian's face flushed, her defiance wavering. She tried to interrupt, but I pressed on, detailing how she had pitted family members against each other, turning small disagreements into grudges, always under the guise of protecting someone. "You've been meddling in our lives for years, Vivian," I said, my voice steady. You tore my mother and Lydia apart, then set your sights on me, trying to poison my view of family. But it's over now. We all see you for who you really are. Vivian looked around, realizing the tide had turned against her. The people she'd once manipulated now saw her true colors, and there was no way to spin her actions as selfless anymore. She opened her mouth, searching for words, but there was nothing she could say. I was just trying to help, she muttered, almost too quietly to hear. No, I said firmly. You were trying to control, and now you're alone because of it. The family sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the truth settling over everyone. I felt a strange sense of liberation, as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I'd reclaimed my life, and for the first time since the wedding, I felt like I could truly move forward. One by one, family members began to leave, each of them nodding to me or offering a brief hug before walking out. Vivian was the last to go. She looked at me, her expression a mix of bitterness and regret. I did it for you, Madison, she whispered, as if that could excuse everything. No, I replied coldly. You did it for yourself, and now you're paying the price. As she left, I knew that I'd made my point clear. The people she'd controlled for years now saw her manipulations for what they were. She was isolated, left to face the consequences of her own actions, and I was finally free from her twisted influence. I didn't know what would come next, but I felt stronger, more certain than ever that I could rebuild the life she tried to tear apart. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like my family was finally united, not by her schemes, but by the truth. If you like the story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.